ClearanceJobs.com, and welcome to our State of the Security Clearance Process webinar brought to you by Accelerate Solutions. We are super excited to chat today, joined by Jill Hamilton, Content Director at ClearanceJobs.com, maven of all of our white papers and amazing content. We want to talk about State of the Security Clearance Process. If you follow us at ClearanceJobs, you know that talking about the security clearance process is certainly a passion point of ours. Understanding the security clearance process is vital, whether you are a job seeker, candidate, security officer, employer. Understanding the policy updates and the shifting environment, super important. So very glad that you're joining us today. And again, thank you, Jill, for also joining me on today's webinar to help us walk through this topic.
Happy to be here. It's a great topic.
Awesome. If you go to the next slide, Phoebe, she is the woman behind the magic curtain, as it were, today, because I cannot be trusted to maintain my own slide deck. If you've had to watch me in a webinar where that was the case, you will know why. But we wanted to kind of unpack the content that you'll find in the white paper, which is already here. So if you haven't checked out the link to it, join there, check out what's going on. Trusted Workforce 2.0 is the major muscle movement when it comes to clearance policy and updates to date. So if you have questions about Trusted Workforce 2.0, again, we have a lot of content about that at ClearanceJobs. We unpack that a little bit in the white paper. The key shift and where we're at with Trusted Workforce 2.0 today is previously we have been at the policy stage. So there have been, I used to have this figure memorized, like 47, 53, let's make up a number, policy documents that have been actually updated over the past several years. Now, with all of that policy update work done, we have shifted into the implementation phase. So we're now doing implementation. So the implementation of Trusted Workforce 2.0, it brings us to a new era. Jill, more to come. But the key things that we're seeing are CV implementation, so continuous vetting, rolling out across the cleared workforce. If you have a security clearance now, you are under continuous vetting. The other thing is NBIS delays, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So the National Background Investigation Services, it'll tie into the slide that you see us pull up next about clearance processing times, but because they're doing this major IT overhaul, and because that IT overhaul has been delayed, that's affected a lot of things going on in this implementation timeline. And then reciprocity issues. Nothing new under the sun here. Reciprocity and transfer of trust issues have been a topic and a concern as long as the security clearance process has existed. Jill, I know you've done a couple of articles on the site about what Trusted Workforce is, about specifically the reciprocity issues and transfer of trust in those processes. I know we've had several contributors kind of talk about those. Can you maybe kind of give some of your highlights on this, implementation timeline when it comes to CV, NBIS, and reciprocity?
Well, I think it's a great topic for reciprocity. It's been a long, it's been a long conversation on that. It will be interesting to see. I think until there's driving more policy changes to make sure that gets implemented. It's great to see the technology being updated behind the scenes, and that can actually drive us forward. I think to the point where it's a lot faster for somebody's clearance to transfer from one agency to another. And the DoD has done a fantastic job, over the years improving their process. And so if you're coming into the DoD from another agency, most candidates will say it's been a great, it's pretty quick. They have things done in days, and they've been measuring their process along the way to tighten it up wherever possible. And I think all this different technology they put in place and systems in place with CV being put in place has made them more, it's just increased their ability to do that. But when people want to go the opposite way, like out of the DoD, it gets a little bit harder. And I think you talk a lot about that also in the paper, where there's more that goes into those questions between suitability versus the security clearance. So those are good conversations to continue to have. But
yeah. I mean, I think, we're with the policy in place, right? It's interesting to see what will actually happen when it comes to implementation. To your point, I think one of the reasons DCSA is kind of, shines here is because they have at least some required accountability and visibility benchmarks. We love to see those. They at least release their reciprocity numbers, kind of something that could happen that would be great to see. It was a little bit more transparency on the IC side when it comes to how long it takes, even transferring between IC elements, because we do kind of have to talk about, the two sides of the coin here. What you're going to experience in DoD versus what you experience in the IC is often very different. And that also ties in, if you go to the next slide, Phoebe, I think our clearance processing times figures, these are just DoD industry figures. The IC does not release its clearance processing time, so I always have to caveat that. These are also still just the fastest 90% of applicants coming in. So if you have a lot of complex issues, if you are that special person who has a ton of foreign travel, if you have other issues, your processing times are probably lengthier than this. And these figures, while not as awful as they were back in the day when we were seeing like 547 days for a TS clearance, are still above the benchmark. So again, I think for us at ClearanceJobs, where we talk a lot of, to talent managers, folks trying to bring folks in, it's really why there's that value proposition for folks who already have a clearance, because even for the faster cases coming in, we're still looking at pretty significant timelines, and certainly not a reduction in timelines. And that also ties back to NBIS, right? Because we've had NBIS issues. Oh, Darren, Lindy, and me. Who let DCSA on the webinar? That's what I want to know. If you've got other hot takes, Darren, let me know. But yeah, on the topic of like this clearance processing times, we still want to strive towards a faster clearance process, and it's still a struggle to get there. I like to give credit where it's due. It's certainly better than it was 3 to 5-ish years ago. But do I see these figures being where I would like them to be? No. Would I really like to see the push for the more transparent, showing the full 100% of those timelines? Because then you're going to get better accountability down the pipeline when it comes to those issues. And I think the shaded box here, if you take out your magnifying glass and look at it, that's how my old eyes would have to view it. It does note here, and chart is in the white paper itself, that some of those NBIS delays were kind of a cause to the clearance processing times. Jill, did you have other thoughts on the clearance processing times?
I think, it's good to still, when you talk to different people in the industry, like, that's the goal of DCSA has had stated before, to measure all of them, not just the fastest 90%. And I think it's also a good, it stands out as their goal is to get this process as fast as possible, because, that's, nobody wins when it's long and drawn out. But I do think, like, when it's not, when we look at the fastest 90%, that's what their typical candidate's going to feel as they're going through the process. Usually it's the outliers, the ones who have, things that a lot of people don't have to go through the process on, that they're the ones that are going to take even longer than this, or, on the flip side, shorter than this, maybe, I guess. But this is your average. But to your point, the more we can get this down, which I think DCSA has done a great job in trying to not only measure, but to put in different actions over the years to at least hold it steady. But if you look at a top secret clearance, 243 days on average, that's, it's 365 days in a year. You're waiting a long time to be able to start your work, to actually get inside the SCIF, to be able to do what you need to be doing if you can't get the interim there in place first. So it is important work that they're doing to get this as fast as possible, because not only are companies losing money because they can't actually charge the government for them, and it kind of ruins their ecosystem, but then the work isn't getting done. And that's really where the important piece is. So it's a worthy goal to continually come back and keep it as tight as possible, which I think they're doing, but then also find ways to improve it with technology, with better processes. All those things can help speed up the system here. But it has been interesting to watch it over the years, when it used to be so long, and them fight so much over to work for this. So.
Yeah, and David has a good question. Like, are these new clearance requests? This is typically new clearance requests that we've seen come in. I know the NISPAC meeting usually breaks down the figure, and I can't recall exactly how many new investigations are being processed each time coming in, but we can certainly pull that stat out and can follow up with you later. But it's worth understanding that, for the requests coming in, this is a part of the process of, getting to work on a clear job. So that was, the question that Jose had, is how do you get a company to sponsor your clearance? A key reason the clearance processing times matter is because we want to get people in the door to be able to do cleared work. And your point, you can't get into the skiff or do all the work if you don't have, at least an interim clearance or some kind of a clearance. There are tips for folks who want to get a company to sponsor them. We actually do have a lot of employers out there, especially some of the bigger employers on ClearanceJobs, here from GDIT, Booz Allen. A lot of those folks are able to sponsor a security clearance coming in. I know Accelerate Solutions is here and has a career for a booth. Definitely reach out to them. They're hiring a lot of background investigators. I've actually heard that applying to be a background investigator is kind of a cool way to break in the door. Talk about learning the process firsthand, right? Becoming a background investigator, getting your clearance, doing some field work. You will understand a lot more about the nuances of that background investigation process. But I always highlight clearable, clearability, ability to obtain, willing to obtain, use those keywords. And then there's certainly a lot of articles on ClearanceJobs that go into even more depth about how to do that. Yeah, and Phoebe listed one here. We'll go to the next slide. So coming soon, personnel vetting questionnaire. Again, on the process of how to apply for a security clearance. I want to talk about this. Jill knows this has been a pain point for me because I don't want to talk about it because I feel like I was talking about EAP for about 5 years before it got fully implemented. So I'm a little scared sometimes that PBQ will be the same. That I keep being told by the government that the rollout is happening even now. So some agencies are starting to use the personnel vetting questionnaire. It is the replacement for the SF-86 and the SF-85 and the SF-85P. It consolidates all of those. So this chart kind of outlines what's being replaced. Instead of these standard forms, we now have parts. So part A, B, C, D, and you're going to fill out a part based on the sensitivity of the position. It's supposed to make it a little bit more streamlined when it comes to the difference between a public trust and a security clearance, which is always confusing, even for those who hold them and work in security. And then again, just make the overall question process more straightforward. So if you've gone through the process and know some of the confusion is not intentionally doing things wrong, but unfortunately, the government typically doesn't care if it was intentional or unintentional. Errors absolutely delay the process. So candidates who fill out the form incorrectly, who misinterpret the language and don't understand it, that causes significant delays. So consolidating the forms is a big step to streamline, but I think the big key takeaway and important one for applicants is you should find language within the forms that is just a lot more straightforward than you typically find in the SF-86. And that hopefully will make this entire process more streamlined, more straightforward, and help to tie into the earlier slide to speed up the security clearance process. Do you have PBQ thoughts, Jill?
Yeah, no, I think aside from, the same as you, is it'll be interesting to see when the timeline is established of when it's going to be rolled out and just how much, can you have somebody be able to, does it help even with reciprocity where it's the same, or not even reciprocity, but just like somebody you move from a public trust over into, a secret clearance or, move it because it is the same form technically then with the different parts that they filled out. If it kind of keeps everything a little bit more streamlined, that will be, I think that'll be great to see. But you're right. I think with, we see a lot of times of people filling out at the SF-86, we even go so far if there's things that you're not sure of and you want to make sure you understand the SF-86 to maybe discuss with the lawyer first on, because understanding how the question is asked to date sometimes has tripped candidates up. So they're reporting on things that, are perhaps outside the bounds of what the question is actually asking for. It also creates more for the investigators to have to look into. So you're right. I think that more plain language that it's a little bit easier to understand, maybe doesn't take a lawyer to dissect it. Not saying the whole thing does, I think that'll be helpful. I think that'll be helpful for candidates and really understand their experience in this process because it is a long, hard process for them to go through. So I think that's encouraging to really try to make sure the language connects and they can understand what they're filling out.
Yeah. And I think it's worth knowing what is in the PBQ. You can actually look it up. It's available online now. So, find a copy of the PBQ. If you're a security officer, absolutely start familiarizing yourself with the form. Most security companies have some kind of standard, training or information they give folks when they're beginning to apply for the security clearance process. I was a little concerned, again, a new administration coming in. I thought maybe the PBQ would change. So like all things, I was hesitant. I didn't tell folks January 1st, update for the PDQ, but now we're at the point again, I'm starting to see that slow roll implementation. So if you're a security officer, I would start updating, preparing some materials, certainly pull from the content we have at ClearanceJobs to start creating your how to fill out the PDQ guides. I think it is time to start doing that work. And again, hopefully what you find in doing that is it's a more transparent process. It has a few more questions about handling protected information. Who knew your ability to protect classified information is kind of important if you're applying for a security clearance. So it kind of bumps up some of those topics that typically weren't in there, and takes away some of the questions that are perhaps less important. And again, because we can't have a security clearance conversation without talking about drugs, obviously, it splits out the marijuana topic into a separate part, specifically because that way, if there is a major change in federal law when it comes to marijuana, it's easy to kind of edit out and update that section without having to say the entire form has to get changed. Because to our point about updating policy documents, gosh, that's a terrible job to have to do in government, is to update all of that policy. And it can take a while. So I think moving this into parts is really a signal too. Going forward, we have a little bit more agility in adjusting the form. Versus having to update the entire SF86. We can now say, oh, part A is a little out of date, part D, split those out and make sure that, parts change as they need to with a little bit more ease in filling out and changing the whole form, which I appreciate. If we go to the next slide, I think we get to talk about the suitability versus security policy shift. This is one of my favorites right now. Because it's wonky. I think very few people care about it. So this is what I really love about it. But those who do care. So when it comes to vetting, there's actually 3 different domains. There's credentialing. That's your CAC, your HSPD 12. That's your credential to get in. There's suitability and fitness, which is, again, not a security clearance. It's that public trust designation. It says, are you suitable or fit for the job? And then last but not least, national security. And that's what gets all the oxygen, eats up all the oxygen in the room. But what we've learned over time is suitability and fitness are really important too. And I refer to them as the wild, wild west because they don't have all of the central kind of, they're not, they don't fall under the NISPOM. They don't have the oversight of a security officer. So a lot of things can happen under the suitability and fitness domain that don't get, all the visibility. So the Office of Personnel Management has granted expanded authority for post-appointment suitability actions. This is pending. So it was, published. It was up for public comment. They are in process of changing that now. And what it will do is make public trust a little bit more in line with what we see for the security clearance process. So OPM will actually be able to make those adverse decisions when information is developed. And that's why continuous vetting rolling out to the non-sensitive public trust population is key to this. So we talked about continuous vetting, kind of brushed over it in the first slide because it's kind of old hat in the security clearance domain. It's fairly new in the suitability domain, but because it's there now, again, we have incidents that are going to be flagged under CV. Previously, they could have just been handled by a program manager. I mean, not even visibility of a security officer. And you could have some pretty egregious violations, especially when it comes to finance. We had incidents of like money laundering at agencies, and people would just get fired instead of actually it addressed through employment action. Now OPM is saying like, hey, no, if an adverse thing comes up, we are going to address it at that level. And that way we don't have people just moving between suitability designations and not having those issues addressed. What do you think about my wild, wild west of suitability, Jill?
No, I think it's good. I think part of the, to date, I pretty much hear suitability conversations from the intelligence community where it's super common. Well, I won't say super common. That's maybe a stretch, but it's common to see, I see them out in the blog, or I talk to people about, you can make it through the security, you get through the security clearance process, and then they're rejected for employment based on suitability factors, and a lot of confusion on that. So I don't know what your thoughts are, and if it rolls completely under OPM, what that does if it would help to kind of make it less confusing for some, like what is it that you're being judged by? Because I do think from what the word on the street has been, depending upon the agency, one thing could fly that was in your background, but then you move to another agency and it's like, oh, for sure, no, you can't make it through the door with that. And so I think so that candidates have a good understanding of what's required. And I'm sure with the right person, people can work things through, and, the extreme job situations, like there are a lot of caveats to it. So it's hard when you make it super standardized where you need this person in and, they're fine, but on paper, they have some factors.
Well, I think the good thing about OPM's policy shift is it's not saying it has to be the authority on making every administrative decision. It is just saying, hey, those adverse actions can't get buried at the agency level. So it is similar to how you have with the security clearance process, right? If something negative happens, it's reported up and that trickles back up. You can't, have a, red flag on your security clearance application and then just hop into the next agency. That has to be addressed, which can be annoying because that's we have loss of jurisdiction, right? If somebody has a flag placed on the record because they did something and then they quit in the meantime or were laid off before it was, adjudicated, then you have to figure out that process. But if you go to the next slide, Phoebe, actually it kind of addresses what you said, Jill. I always forget. I'll actually go to the next slide, Phoebe. I'm skipping ahead. Jill's forcing me to go,
my bad.
Slides here. There are suitability factors, which we talk all the time about the adjudicative guidelines when it comes to the clearance process. But I think because we've just kind of the suitability, the public trust population has been the neglected population when it comes to vetting scenarios, I think. In large part because if you're denied suitability at one agency, it's theoretically less of an impact on your career because you can just apply to the next one, right? The suitability determinations don't carry over typically or haven't. But I think that the shift that they're making with OPM, we're saying, hey, if adverse information is found by an agency, they want that reported up. Now it's going to be more important to understand the suitability factors, which are similar but not identical to the security clearance process. And again, to the point of if there's security officers here, make sure that folks coming into the agency know the suitability factors. And I don't think there's anything saying an agency shouldn't be a little bit more transparent about how it's applying these, because we do know the DEA has a few more issues with drugs than the Department of State. I'm okay with that, and that should make sense. But if they were just a little bit more hey, wait 3 years, wait, but I think right now it's kind of a guess game.
Well, I think what's really cool about this slide, you have the different factors in there, and then the bottom is it's kind of it's the gradient of different agencies could identify, the number of years or, the levels where you can actually quantify all the different components of it, which you do wind up with in the security clearance process when you're filling out the form. It's within the last 7 years, or have you ever, or within the last 5 years, things like that. So if you, even if by agency they had, well, we're just not willing to have you ever. Well, if you ever, then it's a no. Or if it's if it's past 10 years ago, then we're willing to consider, and you could still be considered suitable, that kind of thing. So it'd be helpful to have that type of standard that's identified, except for that's not just the word on the street, Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's big. Knowledge is power, right? It's big what we talk about at ClearanceJobs. People are always why do you provide information about the clearance process? That seems like a boring thing to do. No, it really matters. Filling out the SF-86 is no joke. And if you, and the key to filling it out more accurately, correctly, and protecting national security is to understand the process. And again, I just think because suitability and public trust determinations have seemed a little bit more well, it's not national security, right? So it's not the crown jewels. It's not classified. It gets a little bit less of an emphasis when it comes to a lot of agencies, but I think it's really important. And I think understanding that suitability process also really important. If you're going to go back a slide, Phoebe, we can kind of go through understanding the difference. And if you're confused by this, you're not alone. I talk to security professionals who have been in government for a long time and are confused by this. So it's not, it's not a requirement to fully understand every nuance between suitability and a security clearance, but to what you said, Jill, about if you apply to the intelligence community, they can get very confusing, and understanding the differences and also understanding kind of that process is important, because if you are denied a suitability determination, it is worth knowing that doesn't carry over. Like, again, unless it's, for cause or adverse information is found, you might be unsuitable for one agency, but be able to work in another one based on how they're applying the factors. So understanding that is certainly worthwhile. And then they're governed policy wise in different policies. They have different frameworks and oversights. So they are cousins, but they are not, siblings, I would say, when it comes to the process.
Yeah, and I think the more the suitability factors are identified and you have a baseline, because how sad is it for somebody who went through the whole security clearance like they filled out their SF-86, they've waited, and they've maybe gone for a polygraph, they've gone through all the different steps, and then to make it through that and then be turned down on suitability. But had you known, perhaps you might have not applied to this agency because you know exactly what the standards are. And some of those agencies are out there, or somebody might say, hey, I would suggest you wait another 2 years before you apply here, because that will put you with a better threshold, or you should go to this agency because their threshold is different. But the more that's known out there, then you can, for your own career, because that can be really discouraging, and it can turn away good quality talent. And we might be missing out on them in national security, whereas they're just not going to want to deal with any of that.
Yeah. So you want to go ahead and skip ahead 2 slides, Phoebe. We'll keep going down this. Oh, this is the slide I was most excited about. I get really excited talking about who's in charge of what in the clearance process. And I'm not sure why. Maybe it's because the White House has done a good job making everything a little extra spicy these days, so it gets a lot of questions about it. But because there's so much of what comes out of security clearance policy is born out of executive order. Who's in charge of executive orders? The White House and the executive branch. So there have been, over the past 6 months, a lot of determinations that certainly slowed down over the past 2 to 3 months. But, first day of the new administration, there were several executive orders that literally by pen revoked clearance eligibility for some folks. And a lot of people were like, well, that's not possible. Don't we have all these other branches of government involved in the clearance process? And we do. But when it comes to clearance process and policy, that is born out of executive order. And I'll talk to this in a little bit. But the Supreme Court has very much argued that that is within executive purview. It is the, Article 10 commander-in-chief authorities of the president that allow that. It's national security lined. And so again, the executive branch executive orders spell out all of these clearance policies down to, when we talk about protecting classified documents and declassification, that's all within the ISOO, the Information Security Oversight Office, which sits within the National Archives, which is not just where the Declaration of Independence is housed, it's actually where they are establishing classification policy. Now, it doesn't mean that Congress doesn't have a job and isn't still special in its own way. Congress has oversight authorities. So the Intelligence Authorization Act, the National Defense Authorization Act often have something security clearance related to it, typically saying, hey, intelligence community, why don't you give us a report on how you're processing background investigations? Or why don't you give us some kind of an update? So they have kind of the oversight function to push back into the executive branch and into the agencies and say, hey, tell us how this is going. We're going to require some supporting and some staffing. You're going to have to figure this out. And we see different, than third-party research agencies doing reporting and documentation on these topics. And a lot of that comes out of requests that the legislative branch has made. Last but not least, although they have made themselves much less important, is the judicial branch. They really don't do anything when it comes to clearance process per se, but that's largely because they have previously ruled that it's an executive branch authority. So how it could come out now is if there's a couple of pending cases related to those Trump administration revocations. If those go back to the Supreme Court, it's a chance again for the courts to have another say and say, hey, do we still believe that the president with the stroke of a pen can revoke clearances, that it's all about, bound by executive order? Because an average person has due process rights. So I don't want you to think that like anybody can just take away your clearance. The policy has a lot of baked in due process. We know Doha, all of those agencies, but the president is the big chief and can do things. Do you have any thoughts on my spicy executive authority conversations, Jill?
Not really. I mean, I think it's been an interesting conversation, obviously, this year, but even other years we've had that, like even people questioning how those in authority have a security clearance or access to national security information. And not, and wondering why they didn't have to go through the whole clearance process, just like the average Joe. So I think it's an important conversation, just because we run into a lot of questions over the years on this topic of like who orders what and who says they can do that. Who gave that person a clearance.
Elections matter. I mean, because this comes up too with members of Congress. Members of Congress don't obtain security clearances in the same way either. That's
Right.
enough to give you nightmares sometimes, thinking about folks who I'd like to think there's a really high bar to get into Congress, but we've had too many cases, criminal cases involving members of Congress recently. And what has, again, the process has said is like the election process confers the authority on them so they can actually use their congressional office to request classified information. Now, it should be tied to a committee work or need to know. And this is where, like, again, for all of the folks who are like crying right now because they're like, oh my gosh, how does this happen? I say need to know is also a hedge against executive overreach when it comes to the clearance process, because you still shouldn't be giving anybody access to classified information unless they have a need to know. So the need to know principle applies. Even most, politicians adhere to that principle. Like there is something about saying, hey, we need to protect information at the document level. And a lot of the major breaches out there, the insider risk cases that we talk about, the information was breached. Yes, a person was being a jackwagon, but B, typically there was information that should have been better protected that wasn't. So it's often, a lot of times, the kind of information that is breached is information that someone was accessing that they did not need to access for their job. Now, there's a few cases where somebody in the weeds like was very much operating on behalf of a foreign adversary to pull in specific information. A lot of folks, like the Discord leaks being a recent one, just pulling information that they had no need to know, they shouldn't have been, and then we have a major breach because of that. So you go to the next slide. I've had several people reach out and talk to me about like, hey, again, how is this executive authority conferred? It again, Department of Navy versus Egan, 1984. So the legal framework that we're operating on, giving the president all of this authority in the clearance process, is from this 1984 case. I do think because of some of the casework happening now, we could have a shift in that. Will it fundamentally shift the executive authority on it? I don't necessarily anticipate it. But anytime I see, there's a longstanding court case, again, there's a lot of legal interest. So we could see some push to kind of change what those policies are. But again, it would have to go all the way up to the Supreme Court, because other courts have pretty much held that this is the policy, and it goes back to this 1984 case. Go to the next slide. That's my history lesson for the day. Now I'm good. Now we get to go to our bread and butter, Jill. So national security workforce volatility. I'm going to call it volatile still. There's been some stabilization. We're starting to see the government spigots open. There are, more opportunities out there. Jose asks a great question. If you get cleared through one agency, can you use it at another? Absolutely. So that's for sure. Folks who I know who are going through layoffs, job change, left one agency, your clearance is a career credential. So you can use that clearance. I've even had, again, folks go through the process with the IC and, to Jill's point, be denied suitability or have an offer rescinded at the end. That happened a lot in the past 6 months. Folks, even who had gone through IC internships or things like that and then had their job pulled, they said, hey, can I still use my clearance to work at a different agency, different job? Yes. Once the clearance is adjudicated, it is your eligibility that exists for at least 2 years, hopefully moving to 3 years soon. So you can leverage that clearance to get a job with another agency. And again, if it's going from the IC into the DoD, probably facing a less than a week long process to do that. If it's going from one agency into the next, potentially a little bit longer, but can certainly use it. So there have been federal hiring freezes that have affected security roles. Again, I'm starting to see it's thawing. I don't know, like I don't won't make you predict the temperature, Jill, but I do see a thaw. I see agencies starting to hire. We also have that competing with what I'm hearing folks saying they're worried about a declining interest in government careers. So I always feel like this is a slightly overblown statement. I will say it, but I do think it's worth flagging. If you're a federal contract, if you're a federal government agency, I should say, I would be working on my employer branding strategy. And this is not something the government typically has had to care about. But if you want good applicants coming to work for you at NSA or Cyber Command or CISA or all of these agencies who have these amazing cyber roles to fill, I do think you're going to have to convey the value of those positions still, and potentially in a more assertive way than maybe you did 2 years ago. Because stability has always been the coin of the realm when it comes to government. That's never been the case in GovCon. So the good news is you have good peers to learn from there. But if you don't have stability to ride on, you're going to have to sell your agency's story maybe in a better way to make sure you're getting the best applicant coming in. I mean, we definitely see this reshuffling that's creating gaps in different pipelines. And I think the funny thing is, and I'd love to get your take on this, Jill, like a couple years ago, skills-based hiring was all the rage. I feel like we've had all of this reshuffling, and I feel like hear a lot of talk about AI. I don't hear a ton of talk about how like skills-based hiring could help, especially a lot of these transitioning feds.
Yeah, I do still think skills-based hiring has, I don't know, it has the same spotlight on it, but I think it just takes a while for those changes to trickle down, both to the like contracts that get written. But it has been a change, I think, for the federal government, and it's still being pushed. But that's for their hiring. It has to actually trickle out there to other companies as well to accept that. But yeah, I think things are going to look. It's interesting to see what this year is going to do. Just in it's not a pitch in either direction of it's been a really rough year for so many. But you do see that there were a lot of national security roles were excluded from the freeze, but there was still agencies, they were still freezing things. There were applicants out there saying, hey, the internship I had got pulled, or it's been frozen. So things did get held there if they weren't like mission critical roles, but they were still allowed to hire for things that were mission critical. And even when the hiring freeze got extended to the fall for the federal government right now, actually I think it's October 15th is what it goes to. I wrote about it, but it's like a minute ago. And but national security agencies are that it doesn't apply to them. So they're able to use their discretion, but there's still some constraints, for every 4 that leave, you can hire 1, things like that. There are actual actions being done to reduce the size of the federal government. So I think that declining interest in federal careers is going to be interesting to watch. I think it's an important piece that you have, that you do need to have a brand for your agency. It's not just about, the stability of working for the federal government, because stability can come and go, as we've seen this year. So it's not necessarily that can be your selling factor to get the next generation into working for the federal government, or somebody mid-career to jump over and use their expertise for where they're at in that they've gained in industry and use that for the federal government. You're going to have better reasons than just it's a stable career. You know exactly what to expect. Well, this year you don't know what to expect. And I think that's also it's going to help us tighten, even the security clearance process, where people aren't going to accept the status quo of, oh, it just takes a long time to go through the hiring process for the federal government, and it takes a long time to go through the security clearance process. Well, I think at some point those aren't going to be acceptable. So I think there's going to be some better standards and a better push that when we need to get this fresh talent in, there's going to be a push on those parts of the process that people have just been willing to accept all along. And now they're like, oh, we can't do that anymore. We can't just rest. Not that people are resting on their laurels, but I think like it does put a push in the system to make sure we don't lose good talent.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think the government has gotten by with not considering the clearance process a part of the candidate experience for a long time. Now I will say again, a big part of Trusted Workforce 2.0 was theoretically shifting that, right? So I think DCSA was like listed, became a White House high impact service provider. Right? So like we had this shift of like, oh, the background investigation process ties in. I know that like Rand did a study on behalf of PAC PMO, kind of talking about candidate experience as it applied to security clearance, because before they did just kind of take these two topics as very different. Well, security, and security trumps all, and we don't have to care as much about the process. People are just going to endure a 2-year wait for America. I don't think that messaging is going to continue to apply. And I think that the more, younger generations come in, we're starting to see that shift.
Yeah, I think when security in your role, like you feel very secure in your job and it feels very stable, that was like almost a trade-off that you endured the 9 to 12 month process of not just when I'm speaking just for getting hired for the federal government, of going through the hiring process and the onboarding process. That alone, while the security clearance process was running, could basically take about the same level of time. Obviously depends upon the agency, and some agencies were magically able to just streamline that and onboard candidates much, much faster. But the trade-off used to be like, well, now it's a very secure position. You know exactly what you need to do to move up throughout the federal government, all those things. Well, when the rug gets pulled out from underneath that, well, now there's no longer that trade-off. So, yeah. And people then also didn't want to leave because they're like, well, I made it through the beginning part. So I'm just going to stick it out and I'm going to keep staying instead of jumping to this other lucrative job offer. So I think it's going to naturally push, I think, the federal government to be better about their hiring and their retention. So those that do stay, it is a good, the system works better.
Yeah. How's that pension security feel? Not very good these days. I mean, the other thing it ties into is like, I think we're going to see aggressive competition for the need to fill, especially national security. As much as I hate to refer to big, beautiful bills, I mean, it's true. Like there were a lot of areas of growth in national security tied into, I'm going to steal language that the Honorable William Burns used at his Baker Awards dinner ceremony. I thought he encapsulated it well. It's similar language that I've heard Sue Gordon reference before. Like we have a lot of, he called it a complex and combustible time frame that we have when it comes to the national security landscape due to strategic competition with China, again, with tariffs, with a lot of, with just the alignment of our competition framework, technological transformation that's changing how we live, work, fight. And then also the transnational challenges like pandemics, climate change, the need for intelligence agility as we kind of, align with global competition. I thought like, yeah, it's a challenging environment, and it's a challenging environment we're going into with not necessarily doesn't always feel like our most robust posture when it comes to staffing. So I think for agencies and folks who care about this, focusing on your national security workforce, staffing, the importance of security and the security clearance hiring process, super important. You can go to the next slide. I think this might be the last one. What is time? Yeah, I like to talk about opportunity because I'm an optimist, even though I was talking about all those, serious topics there a minute ago. I had to steal the serious topics from somebody with honorable in the front of their name. We look at this as an opportunity too, to say like, hey, we can also continue innovating. So the Clearance Ready Reserve is a big one. This is huge for me. I think we should have a Clearance Ready Reserve activated where we have folks who are able to opt in and say, hey, for $99 a year, I know the government can keep me in a ready reserve posture. We're seeing a lot of more like the DoD, allowing folks to enter in at the, mid-grade level as, senior kind of software positions. What if you just allowed the rest of the regular ready workforce say, hey, I might do a stint in the private sector, but might want to come back. I want to stay in the clearance ready reserve. Also, direct hiring authority. A lot of folks have it. I think if they haven't known how to use it, now is the time. And then the other one too is contract reform. I mean, you spoke to that before, Jill. It's like skills-based hiring. Contractors can talk about it all they want, but it's true. Unless the contract process is reformed, it won't happen. And the same goes with clearances. A lot of contractors don't allow folks to work with an interim clearance or bring in clearance eligible people. But if we reformed the contract process and allowed that, I think we could see major shifts. What are your innovation opportunity thoughts?
Well, I think these three are really huge in that, like, while there's a lot of frustrations and struggles, that this year has brought up. I think there's also the different opportunities that we've seen even just over the years, not even just this past year. I think the clearance ready reserve is a fantastic idea to have people ready and waiting to go, to allow you the flexibility to jump from thing to thing, to move into an uncleared role for a while. We've watched people do that and then just be so concerned about, I don't want to lose the security clearance. And yet, nothing's changed in their life. They didn't plant a special farm in the last 2 years that would make them no longer eligible. They've lived their life in the same way. They're just gaining experience in a different way that could be super helpful. So I think having a system like that in place can go a long way to just making us a very nimble, agile workforce that can meet the changing needs, but also build a talent that actually has all the different experiences, because that's also super important when it comes to, like, the intelligence community especially could benefit from this. What you find is people, they get in and then they either make it to retirement and move on from there, or they just are like, I can't do this anymore, I want out. But then we lose their expertise, we lose their understanding, we lose what they know because they've gone elsewhere, because they just wanted a different style of work, because there is something, once you're in it, So I think that can open up so much for us, as well as, so you point to the direct hiring authority. It's not that people don't have it, they just haven't known how to use it, or the bureaucracy level, like the things they feel like, that hoops they have to jump through probably to be able to use it. That can have a major impact as well, where people just don't, they have, when you're having to justify line item by line item for your agency for all the dollars that you need for the budget, and you're constantly having to do budget drills, and then you add in, now I've got to justify, I really need this role to be filled, and I don't want to have to go through the normal process, and shouldn't need to, so it doesn't take as long. Well, that could be tiresome for managers. So I think sometimes maybe they're just not well versed in doing it, or they don't have like the manpower to go through all the tape that they have to do. So, but yeah, I think there's lots of different opportunities that can be happening.
Yeah, optimist for life, right? I mean, there's a lot of challenges, but I think we have opportunities. So now we're like so good at timing, Jill. I mean, look at us. Our time's about wrapped up here. If you have final questions, drop them in. But what comes next? We're in a period of active reform. Changes are happening. The implementation timelines going out across the agencies. For me, I'm like, policy is one thing. Action is everything, right? So I find we're in a really fascinating time with, again, all of these 40 to 50 policy documents that have been rewritten in the past, 5 years as it relates to the security clearance process. What are agencies going to do with those shifting policies? How are they staying compliant with Trusted Workforce 2.0? How are we adhering to timelines? What's going on with suitability and changes there? And then again, supporting cleared professionals through the major workforce transitions that we have, because this is a changing, shifting time. I think companies, agencies, individual security officers really need to make sure they're providing holistic support for their workforces. I think, as cleared professionals, keep remembering that the work you do matters. Like, this is incredibly important work every day, but especially now, because we've had so many shifts, we've had so many changes when it comes to what's happening, and we're going to keep having them, right? Like, there's just going to be we're getting ready right now. The first batch of people who ever were enrolled in continuous vetting are up for their 5-year renewals right now. I haven't heard a peep about that, but the security, the person in me who dies inside when I have to get paperwork is trying to figure out how, with the current timelines we have, how we're processing all of those recertifications. So just a lot of shifts, a lot of changes, and we don't always know the answer to all of them. Like, how are we going to process all of those recertifications? But certainly need to, again, stay agile, stay informed, stay understanding of the process, and stick with your friends at ClearanceJobs because we're here for you. What else do you got, Jill?
No, preach. I think it's such a good conversation to have. Sometimes people, like you said, people consider it a boring conversation, talk about security and all that, but it's so much important for understanding the process, as for the candidate side, but also all those security officers behind the scenes, just trying to. I think over the years ago, it feel like they're trying to read the tea leaves, of like trying to understand what they're supposed to be doing. They don't want to be out of compliance and be the reason why their company loses their contract, or all those different things that they're tracking. And so but also it's helpful too to be able to give information back to the government of how things are going, how it's felt. Like, has it felt improved? Well, yes. But are there gaps where we can do more for candidates and for companies? Well, yes. So that's a really important conversation. So I'll let you take David's question.
David, we get to end with
big
this
of an impact.
I mean, it's been pretty bad. I mean, NBIS is a big issue. I don't know how you can follow this process and see the, multi-billion-dollar investment without a lot of return. I have some empathy for the process because when we talk about government technology programs, when is the last time you had a major government technology program success story? I would like to hear of one. So this has been one that has faced a lot of issues, but I mean, it has certainly a lot of the things that we were supposed to see implemented last year none of them were implemented because of NBIS delays. So NBIS delays have been the major thing. There's a reason the Government Accountability Office has frequently flagged it as a major issue. The security clearance process remains on the high risk list, largely due to those NBIS delays. So it's something I know the agency is aware of and have really worked hard to get on track. The issue is, it just seems to be when those things kind of spiral out of control, right? And they get, it becomes just a vicious spin cycle of ongoing delays. And then realizing how big it was and how many things they were trying to replace at once. We did a chart on a previous State of the Security Clearance Process white paper that outlined, NBIS is not one system. So I think sometimes you think one IT system that they were updating, well, how in the heck could it take that long? It was a system of systems. And so I think because they were trying to address so many issues at once versus, I'm going to sound old and say it, eating the elephant one bite at a time, but did not take that approach. And then you had like a pretty delayed process. So when we're looking at delays that we have now, don't eat the elephants. I know we need a better analogy. Anybody got one? Drop it in. But yeah, I mean, the NBIS delays have been significant.
Well, I think you're dealing with so much data. Like you're moving, like it's years of data in different old systems that probably don't want to talk to the new system. Or if you build the new system to track different things, it's just not as easy as it all sounds. It's like when you talk about like working on your house and you're like, oh, we'll just knock out that wall and we'll just shoop, 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 and just do this, like we tend to think of it like that instead of like understanding, like when you have the system of systems, it does take a lot. So I do have a lot of empathy for them on what it would take to do that. Once you put something out there and say it's going to be done by this day, well, and the whole world is watching, well, it's kind of hard for that.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and I think it does, I think sometimes highlighting, the success stories, again, to David's point there are like the enrollment of everybody into continuous vetting is a success story. Mm-hmm. That is, technology had to do that, right? It's tied into it. So we have layered those things on. I think because it is just such a major system, and because it's become this like awful 4-letter word, it has been a problem versus sometimes I wish we could break it out, and again, because there's the case management tool, right? There's the e-adjudication, there's there's pieces within NBIS, and to your point, there might be success stories within there, but because what we see are same. I just scream it out loud. When we see just this major, NBIS delays, what we don't see are, oh, here are the 2 systems that they got online that are working well, and here's the 3 that are really terrible, and here's the legacy technology that's this big, ice cream sundae we're trying to eat one bite at a time. I don't know, but there's like these different pieces of it. But I mean, it's a lot of folks. I've heard folks say just like get rid of it. Get rid of it. I think GAO. I think we've heard from DCSA that's not an option. Like we're not getting rid of NBIS is essential. They see a path to getting it on track, and I think they have it on that path now. And only time will tell if we're there. But a lot of the stuff too, I think agencies could just get on with it and start implementing things. Sometimes we kind of take the thing that's not working well as the excuse to not do the micro solution that we could accomplish to improve the process. So I'm hoping for some of those micro success stories in the clearance process over the year to come.
Yeah.
On that note, goodness, you all hung with us for a full hour of security clearance updates. State of the security clearance process brought to you by Accelerate Solutions. Love Accelerate. Love that orange logo. So thank you to Brett Benson and to the entire Accelerate team. Check out their booth and their content. Check out the state of the security clearance process white paper here. Appreciate everybody who's a part of the ClearanceJobs community and the national security community. I'm not going to know how to turn off the webinar, so something's going to